Hi, this is Alex Bryan. Welcome to our webinar today about relocating and expanding operations and supply chain from China to Mexico. We appreciate you joining. We've got a lot of people in attendance today, so we've received a lot of questions already from people wanting to talk to the speakers. So we'll kind of jump right into it. First of all, is on just a couple of questions and housekeeping about questions for the speakers. The registrants are encouraged to ask questions of the speakers throughout the webinar. You need to click on the question section of the control panel. The control panel, if you look at the control panel, the arrow should be facing to the right, and then you go to the question section, type in the questions, and then they'll be sent to us, and we'll be able to ask the speakers. And you can answer those questions all throughout the process. We encourage that. So the presentation today is going to be mostly a Q&A session on questions with the speakers. We're going to cover a little internal background first, just introduction of East West and who we are. Second, it's going to be around introduction of corporate speakers. Third, about economic challenges, what's going on in China, because that's really laid the groundwork for partially what's going on in Mexico now, in this effort to diversify beyond China into Mexico. Then we'll go into the Q&A session, and the Q&A session will last about 45 minutes. It is the majority, the bulk of this entire webinar. And then we'll have the conclusions. All right, so kind of jumping into it real briefly, I'm Alex Bryan, the president of East West Associates. We started in 2005. Very briefly, we operate in 5 markets. We operate in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, and the US. We really offer 4 services. We're not lawyers, we're not accountants. We have 4 core services around operational and corporate strategy, operational work such as moving factories, closing factories, setting up operations, procurement, supply chain, executive recruiting, commercial, which is a lot of competitive intelligence, data gathering, and the finally is risk management, which is less relevant in the US, but quite relevant in our other markets of Mexico and Poland and Southeast Asia and China, where we have a team of ex-military and ex-police who do a lot of background research for us on new suppliers, new customers, fraud, corruption. The people we have at East West that operate here have really one qualification, and that is they all have run operations. They all come up with different functional skill sets, whether it's operations, supply chain, procurement, sales, marketing, human resources. They all got promoted and had P&L responsibilities for running a Western multinational on the ground in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, or Central Eastern Europe. And so they are, some cases expats, some cases local nationals. I've just pulled some of the titles out, put them on this page. You can see it. It's pretty fair distribution between China, Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. Okay, these are the 4 markets we operate in. So today's focus obviously is going to be on Mexico. But as we know, what's driving a lot of Mexico, what's happening in Mexico is occurring originally coming out of China. So before we jump in, let me introduce the 2 primary speakers. We've got great speakers today. First, Stefan Lochter. He's calling in from Mexico, and Dan McLeod is calling in from the US. Stefan, if you please take the time and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. I'm a national German national, but living for more than 20 years now in Mexico. Yeah, running operations. I have been running mainly automotive operations or automotive supplier operations in Mexico, and the last few years I was fully responsible for a German company for operations. All included loss and P&L in Mexico. And since 2019, I'm supporting mainly German automotive companies in supply development here in Mexico. So thank you very much. And I'm handing over to Dan. Yeah?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dan. I'm Dan McLeod. Been with East West for about 5 years now, going on 5 years. My background is primarily in operations, designing factories, running factories, hiring and staffing facilities, and also developing supply chains and sourcing for those operations. He spent 21 years in Asia, about 2/3 of that in China, but also significant stints in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, and in the Philippines, where in addition to running operations, also was involved in managing capital expansion projects, so managing the design, construction, startup, and staffing of those operations, and developing supply chains for them. Since I left Asia about 5 years ago, been doing a fair bit of work in Mexico in particular around sourcing, supply chain development, and also site selection work for folks interested in setting up operations in Mexico. Alex?
All right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stefan. So now we'll kind of jump into the next section, section 3, which is about the economic challenges in China and in Mexico. And this really kind of sets the basis for what's happening in Mexico now. But I think everyone's seeing the results of it. We want to kind of give a brief overview of it and kind of also speculate about 2023, both for China and for Mexico. So in China, if you look at this over the last 13 years or so, for Western companies that have been operating on the ground in China, there have been a series of factors, a series of events, factors which have occurred that's making operating in China much more tough, much tougher than for those of us who went in the late 90s, early 2000s over to China, right? Everyone went, they set up operations, set up supply chain there. Gradually, you've got rising labor costs, operational costs coming in China. Then we stayed over there operating. You've seen growing regulatory complexity over the last several years in China, which really filled in around the manufacturing. And that's going on. The regulatory side was really over more the last 10, 12 years. Since then, obviously, for everyone who's operated over there, we had numerous cases, right? Your operating facility, people leave, they move down the road 2 miles and they set up their own operation there. There's just a significant increased domestic competition. And you can look at across industry sectors, the automotive, appliance, electronics, where a lot of the Western companies went in early, had good market share. It's gradually, in many cases, been eroded by increased and tough competitors, that you have in China. That's been exacerbated by President Xi's 2025 Buy China initiative, which is more nationalistic. It's moving away from the whole marketplace, but encouraging people to buy China and buy products from Chinese companies. Then obviously we had the trade tariffs from the last administration that increased pressure and increased costs for companies who were producing in China, bringing outside of China. They were sourcing in China, increasing their costs. And then of course you've had COVID, which has had a significant, everyone knows it's affected travel, it's affected ability to operate on the ground there, to go to China. It's affected our business relationships within and created tensions between both governments. And then followed by, we've obviously had significant increase in costs and shipping delays, logistics disruption, although we are seeing shipping rates come down. So I want to just kind of take a minute here. If you're looking at China and understanding why so many executives are migrating from China to Mexico to improve their raw material reliability, their manufacturing preparedness, I'd like to turn that over to Dan. Dan, if you would take this.
Sure. Many of these are familiar to those of you in the audience, but certainly in the last over 2 years, going almost 3 years, COVID lockdowns have been a source of frustration due to disruption of supply chain, but an area that's gets talked about less, but we have several conversations with our client base that they've seen the fraying of their organization structure, the inability to travel back and forth, either travel to China and work with the people there, or just as importantly, their folks from China being able to easily travel to the headquarters for training and develop those relationships. So that's so you get a fraying of the organization structure in addition to the disruptions, and those disruptions are capricious. Just this, as an example, just this week, Shanghai being the largest commercial center in the country, folks from Shanghai that want to leave Shanghai and visit outside the city are now required to self-quarantine for 3 days before they can have meetings. And it's really, those sorts of lockdowns come and go and creating disruption. China, Taiwan, U.S. trade tension, geopolitical tensions are certainly a concern. We've spoken with clients that have actually put in place strategies to minimize the reliance upon Taiwan as a supply as well, being concerned about the future of that and looking to expand outside of Asia for critical sources. Labor costs continue to go up. Expect that to level off a bit as the economy is greatly slowed in China, but historically consistently we're seeing 8 to 10% increases year over year for 20 years, such that the difference in labor costs between China and other developing economies such as Mexico is evaporated. Logistics costs were skyrocketing during COVID. That has backed off some, but it's still a significant driver. And in many cases, relating back to COVID, there's also a risk of port shutdown, major port shutdowns, which we've seen in the last 3 years that can both disrupt from a timing standpoint and add costs. And this is also related to transportation. The tariffs have been a big driver for the last 4 years or more, and many companies adjusted initially by either passing on or trying to pass on those costs or splitting those costs with their clients, but it's now come to a point where many people feel that this is not going away anytime soon, and so it's certainly been a lot more activity in the last year or so to take a more permanent solution to dealing with the tariff situation. The regulatory in China has been getting more difficult for many years, as Alex mentioned, and it really we started to see it in terms of bureaucracy around permitting and planning, and then more recently, within the 5 years, say the last 5 years, a more confrontational attitude between safety and environmental regulators and companies operating. Whereas before it was rather collaborative, it's now become much more confrontational. And then, the big question is do you see changes in 2023? And a lot of opinions vary widely, but probably not. There was no change in government this year. Xi Jinping is going to stay in office and generally considered to have consolidated his power base, and that will continue to strengthen and continue on that trajectory. So we don't see a bright light at the end of that tunnel. We see sort of continuing the same direction. And people ask us, when are COVID travel restrictions going to lift? There was some movement last month, easing some of the quarantine requirements, but again, that changes from week to week. And so, no one I know thinks anything's going to change significantly before the middle of next year. But again, that's all speculation.
Dan, I guess worst case scenarios, and we've heard rumors coming out of Shanghai and the commercial service talking about potentially allowing commercial travel back into China sometime mid next year, although that date keeps getting pushed out and pushed out and pushed out.
Right. We've seen quarantine requirements decreased and going down, but it's still pretty onerous for people that are just trying to get in and out of there for a week to do business. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing from our clients. I mean, we're right now helping a client. We're building a manufacturing factory in China, and just the ability to do that and the COVID restrictions has really affected our ability to do that. It's going to complete on time and on schedule, but the ability to get people in and out of there. And we know from other clients talking about the product, what's really hurting for those who are doing product development work and trying to sell into China. If you can't get your engineers from the U.S. over there, it's really affecting product. So I guess worst case scenario is the lockdowns continue, right? The U.S.-China tariffs seems to be the one thing that Republicans and Democrats do agree on, so don't see that going away anytime soon. And if the tensions gets much worse between the U.S. and Taiwan, Dan pointed out a lot of people are making plans beyond Taiwan. That's true. I think for going to Mexico, Mexico, Thailand, Vietnam are all benefiting from what's going on in China.
Mhm.
Don't see any change in that. Stefan, you brought up a question around around same kind of issues going on in Mexico. So if we looked at Mexico, can you tackle this? Like, what are people going to Mexico for, and what's the future of Mexico in 2023?
Yeah, would be happy to do that. Just picking up the point of COVID, yeah. In some aspect, I would have liked a little bit more strong government in this direction, yeah, with more restrictions. But Mexico is one of the most open companies with their reaction to COVID, yeah. So you would not fear any bigger lockdowns or anything that would hinder your work in Mexico. Yeah? So we can take this part out. Yeah, you have to follow rules, but that's normal. I would consider it normal rules. Yeah, but nothing that hinders you traveling or working in Mexico. Yeah. One of the big opportunities or the advantages of Mexico is you can have a stable flow of products and components, yeah, because of the of being close to North American customers, yeah, and assemblers. You have access to competitive and qualified labor, yeah. Not everywhere in the country, but where you have industrial zones, you have that. Yeah? You have local raw material and components in Mexico built. Yeah. And another advantage is obviously the USMCA, the former NAFTA. Yeah. With everything you can produce in Mexico, you could be tax-free exporting to the United States and Canada. Yeah. Based on these rules, means you have a much more reliable base to calculate your costs if you are consuming the goods in US and Canada and build them in Mexico. You are not exposed to any tax or tariffs changes within the time frame the USMCA is in action. It's another big advantage is you have very good connections to Mexico. Yeah, it's only a few hours away from for example, the automotive sector in the US. Yeah, you fly down in 4 hours, you are there. You can see, you can look, see, and touch whatever goes on in Mexico. Yeah, so there's a big ease in the access to the real work, and so you can control. You can see and control the costs and the quality, for example, yeah, which you cannot if you're shipping the goods for 6 weeks in a container. And now talking about, this is also a difficult question, talking about the business environment 2023 in Mexico. I would personally not see big changes. Yeah? The change was done 3 years ago and is now in action with a very labor-friendly Mexican president. Yeah? So you would feel that all the rules, the laws, and everything went a little bit more into being labor-friendly, meaning protecting the workers. Yeah. But it is a fairly stable environment. It will not suffer disruptions from my point of view. Yeah, so at least for 3 years, you will see another continuing positive environment in Mexico for doing business.
Stefan, you're saying 3 years, that's the next 3 years of the president's current term.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll jump now into the Q&A session. What we've done is we've got 3 quick slides just reviewing, giving an overview of manufacturing clusters in Mexico, where they are, the major which Stefan can briefly go through, and then we open up for questions. Stefan, if you would just kind of, if you would review these, just kind of briefly review these for the residents, just kind of help set the stage.
Yeah. So Mexico, besides the fact that the government the last 20 years tried to support development of clusters in Mexico by tariffs and taxes. Some of the clusters are also geographically linked. We will see this in the later slides. Aerospace, for example, you have a very strong aerospace manufacturing base, which is nearly half of the foreign direct investment in Mexico, but this is also technology driven. Everything you have to build up as technology is a lot of investment. As said here, we have approximately 300, I would say even more than 300 aerospace manufacturing companies, including the OEMs like Bombardier, and tier 1s, 2s, and 3s, everything supplying out of Mexico into Mexican aerospace manufacturing. And we go down to very small companies. I know a company that's just one guy running it with specialty machines for rocket valves, for the steering of the combustion. Then we have an automotive sector that has been developed since the 60s, which is very strong, and it's the 4th largest exporter, Mexico. You wouldn't believe it so far, of auto parts in the whole world, and of course the first one in auto exports into the United States. There are, sorry, I lost my screen. 10 of the automotive OEMs are present in Mexico, and there are more coming in. And those OEMs developed their supplier network already, and you have a belt of suppliers around these automotive OEMs, like Saltillo, Monterrey, the Bajío, Querétaro, San Luis Potosí, but we will see this in the next slide, I think. Medical devices, very close to the US, there has been developed a belt of suppliers for medical devices, and it's around 650 companies that export up to 8 billion altogether into the US, and that's about 92% of all their production goes into the US, just a little bit into Europe and Asia. Electronics. Mexico is not really specialized in electronics. It's electronics assembly, but they are doing electronic sub-assemblies, computer parts, home appliance, and consumer goods. It's not that it is developed; it is built in Mexico.
So Stefan, an example that would be like PCB boards. We're getting those out of Asia, but they're being assembled in Mexico. Correct.
You get components out of Asia and you assemble close to your customer in Mexico. And this is related to the specialization of certain product areas. Appliance manufacturing, furniture manufacturing, it is fairly logical. You have cheap labor and you have bulky items. So it was always good to produce them close to the consumption. And this drove the creation of of a very strong appliance and furniture manufacturing in Mexico. Yeah, and Mexico became the 5th largest exporter of those goods. Yeah, and as you can see in this map, the main manufacturing industry is based or is located in the green zone. Yeah, and what happened here, first of all, it was developed close to the border. It's also logical. Logistics was very is very convenient from there, and the Mexican government gave a lot of incentives to do that. The famous maquiladora business, yeah, meaning you are just the workbench for international companies or for companies located out of Mexico. Drove a lot of this development in the green belt close to the border, and then it went down to the south, where you see in the center and the south it's more the automotive industry nowadays, yeah? Because they were looking for more cheap labor and knowledge, skills, which they couldn't take anymore from the belt. So right now you still have some areas which could be developed in Mexico, but if you want to establish a safe business, you would try to stick to the green areas right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now we talk verbally about the clusters. The aerospace cluster is mainly around Querétaro. Yeah, that's where the manufacturer, the OEM sits, Bombardier. But you have the supplier belt close to the border: Sonora, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, and Baja California. Yeah, and here you always see a very good development if one starts an operation in Mexico and needs skilled workforce, including engineers. Usually you also start up some partnership with universities, and this is what happened in Querétaro. That's why you have a very, very strong aerospace education in Querétaro. Yeah. The automotive belt, I would call it, automotive cluster. Yeah. They have been established first in Coahuila. Yeah, that's also close to the border. But then it went down to, we're lacking here, Puebla. Yeah, with 2 OEM factories sitting there, Audi and Volkswagen. Yeah, 2 of the most important ones for the European automotive sector. But between those two locations, one in the south and one in the north, they created a supplier belt, yeah, which includes San Luis Potosí, Sonora, Nuevo León, Querétaro, Jalisco, and Guanajuato. Yeah. You find basically all the international automotive suppliers in what we call in Mexico El Bajío. Yeah. And now going into the medical devices, yeah. Baja California, with being very, very close to California, yeah, had established 67 medical device companies, yeah. And since you are at one point of time running low with possibilities of growth, yeah, this went over to Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, which is also close to the border, and Jalisco, for example. Guadalajara is also very strong in medical devices. Electronics. Here, the electronics industry also is concentrated, or has been concentrated close to the border. Coahuila, yeah, and we also have something in Sonora, which is not mentioned here, and in Jalisco. Yeah, this was driven by companies like IBM and HP in the 80s and 90s of last century. Then they moved out of Mexico into China, yeah, and what was left was only electronics components installation on the boards. Yeah, so the electronics industry changed, yeah, but it still has strong clusters for electronics assembly in these areas mentioned here. Yeah, and most of these components go into appliances, telecommunication, and automotive. And appliance manufacturing and furniture manufacturing, yeah, you have very strong appliance manufacturing with EG and Mabe in Querétaro and San Luis Potosí, for example. Yeah, and also in Tecate, Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Saltillo. We could name a few other states or cities, but those areas were especially attractive due to their logistics location, yeah, and the ease to travel to the United States.
That's excellent, Stefan. Thank you for giving that kind of background on it. That kind of serves as the basis for a lot of these questions. We have a bunch of questions come in, so I'll kind of characterize. We got 5 on this page. We got 5 on the next page. We've had several more come in. As we go through these questions, if we don't get to everyone's question, we will reach out to you within the next 3 days after this. Again, if you have questions, please go on your control panel, hit the questions, type it in, and we'll come back to you. So why don't we jump into these topics now? On the first one about labor cost availability of engineering, mid-level management, blue collar, talking about industrialized north versus central Mexico. Dan, if you would kind of share your kind of thoughts on that question that we have.
Okay. Yeah, so pretty broadly, a couple of themes here. Engineering skill sets have seemed to be quite strong, and particularly Monterrey has historically been a strong industrial area and has great schools there. You see good schools scattered around the country, but particularly historically, you see the Northeast for engineering skills. Mid-level managers are available, but the demand for them is becoming increasingly tight. And what you see at very senior levels, senior manager levels, and senior supply chain professionals, you see salaries and wages, not a lot of difference between the US and Mexico in many cases for those senior positions. For an engineering or mid-level, you see a pretty substantial gap and good value there. Blue collar labor availability is still generally strong, although with the growth recently, it's gotten a little bit tight. One of the things we've looked at on site selection around labor availability is we look at demographic data on families, on intact families versus and the converse, that being migrant or people who have relocated to an area for work. And northern Mexico in particular has a lot of migrants working there. And the reason we look at compared to central Mexico, the reason we look at that is, for one reason would be stability of the workforce. And if you've got a solid local grown workforce, they're less likely to job hop, and they're less likely to chase small increases in wages. Having said that, there's been a lot of discussion about, there's been in the last 2 years a significant increase in the minimum wage, and there's a discussion now that it may jump another 20% in the in the next couple of months. That's had less of, that primarily affects entry-level labor, and it's off a low base, certainly. It has less effect on management level and engineering level. So there'll be some effect, but certainly nothing like what you see on entry level.
Another question popped up here on that we just got, and it kind of ties into question number 4 there. So Stefan, on number 4, talks about local Mexican suppliers of components, finished goods, right? Are there commodity sectors that are still competitive outside of Mexico? And I guess you've talked a lot about previously the whole idea that Mexico is not China. There are certain sectors in Mexico that are perfect for Mexico, certain sectors that are not. Can you discuss on that?
Yeah, perfect. Picking up that point, Mexico is very, very good for labor-intensive products. Yeah, as long as your labor content is high enough compared to the rest of your costs, Mexico can be very competitive. Anything that is being imported, and this talking about raw material that is not available in Mexico, or goods that have to be prefabricated in other countries, yeah, it takes away part of the advantage of the cost advantage being in Mexico. Yeah. Also investment into technology. Yeah. Mexico has not the accessibility or the ability to create own technologies. Yeah? Injection molding, the machines come from the US, from Europe, China, or wherever. So those are imported, and this import is not reducing the cost. Let's put it that way. Yeah. But if you have a lot of assembly within your product, Mexico is definitely has definitely a cost advantage compared to many other countries. Yeah? And now going back to question number 2, I was prepared to answer 2 prior to 4. This is partly created by the politics that were driving the country for the last 40 years. Yeah, as I mentioned before, Mexico tried to pull business into Mexico, but only the assembly of the business. Yeah, the famous maquiladora, the extended workbench concept. Yeah, where a foreign company owns material, yeah, and just pays the labor to bring the good back into their own country. Yeah, and this was really the vision of Mexico for many years. That's why the belt around close to the border is very well developed with a lot of international companies. Yeah, and this was one of the incentives. You only had to pay taxes in Mexico on the labor cost, yeah, on the value add you're doing. Yeah? But you control the value add because you have the raw material and you have the piece price when exporting from Mexico. Yeah, so basically you only pay for the labor. You own the machines, you own everything, but as an international company. Yeah, this concept is still available. You can still do this, but it's getting a little bit more controlled and complicated. Yeah? In general, tax incentives and cash incentives from federal government are no longer available. Yeah? But you have a lot of incentives related to tariffs. If your company belongs to certain clusters, and there are 16 clusters that are supported by the federal government, yeah, including automotive, steel, electronics, and you can import mainly without paying taxes, without paying any tariff for your import from most of the countries in the world, even from China. Yeah, then you convert everything in your product, yeah, and you sell it to the United States or anywhere else in the world. And if you're doing it under USMCA, you might be even operating under no tariff or reduced tariffs, yeah, for your product, and for you export to other countries for no tariffs. So you have a tariffs advantage. Yeah. The government is also supporting training, but this is not on a federal basis anymore. It is on a regional and local basis now. The state government or even the local government is paying incentives if you do a partnership with university schools, or if you are training people in your company. Yeah, this in some cases it's only waiving the taxes for the salaries, yeah, which is only 2% of the salary. But in other cases, it can go up to cash incentives, depending on the region where you are. That's very specific. Yeah, and yeah, and as I mentioned before,
someone just emailed a question around that. I'm talking about incentives and it's a company that's in the electronic sector that's looking to Mexico, and they wanted to know whether the Mexican electronic supply chain, like supplying electronics, supplying automotive, does that have kind of a strong local suppliers for PC fabrication, die casting, distribution network of chips? So can you talk a little bit about the electronic sector supporting the automotive industry?
Yeah, obviously the chips, everything is usually being imported. Yeah, and the PCB boards, you have manufacturers of PCB boards in PC boards in Mexico, but it is not at their competitiveness is not at a level where the Chinese is. Yeah, so usually all PCB and components are being imported. Yeah, and the import is a no-brainer. It's very simple. The assembly is very strong in Mexico. Yeah, assembly, testing, in some cases, design of the boards, and that's a strong availability. You have you have to organize your imports. You do not have the very big distributors that would make it easy for you to pull chips anytime you need. Yeah, that's something you would need to build up over time. Yeah.
Yeah. When you're talking about on the component products, the company emailed here, they're in the fabrication business, and they're trying to understand the steel situation in Mexico, right? They're making fabricated parts. Can you talk a little bit about, you and Dan talk a little bit about the commodity sectors that are still more competitive outside of Mexico, like when you're looking at China and Southeast Asia, what commodities are they supplying they're still going to supply to Mexico because Mexico is not as cost competitive or doesn't have? And their question was, is there availability of steel in Mexico?
Mexico is mainly importing raw steel, and is rolling steel, for example, is stamping steel, everything you can build out of steel. Yeah, there are only two manufacturers of black steel. Yeah, and no manufacturer of stainless steel, for example. Yeah, and therefore the market is not very competitive compared to the raw material. Yeah, but to the processing, if it is labor intensive. Yeah.
And Dan, that kind of goes to the second part of this question was kind of looking at kind of this trade-off between going to Mexico. The product may not be less expensive in Mexico compared to what's coming to China, but you're doing that as a trade-off for more reliable supply chain.
More of a
Can you
reliable
address
supply,
that?
yeah, more of a reliable supply chain, but also depending on the finished product. You know, if you for bulky materials, you can reduce your logistics costs certainly by doing the stamping and assembly in Mexico. So you're not shipping bulky product across the water. Certainly, as Stefan mentioned, the steel supply there are domestic producers of steel, but not specialty steels or stainless, and much of the import. What you see a lot of Chinese steel coming into Mexico, but also for higher grades, you're seeing Korean and Japanese steel, and more from Turkey as well. So it's a pretty broad supplier base for steel, but it's not particularly domestic. So.
And when you're looking at products like aluminum die casting or die cast fabrication, is a lot of that being conducted there in Mexico?
It's being conducted and it's growing because and a lot of it's recently being driven by people that have supplied out of China, which is got a very strong base for die cast products, and people looking to leave. And so there's been a lot of growth and demand in the Mexico market for that. Depending on the technology used, that can be a rather capital intensive operation, and so many of the suppliers are a bit capital strapped. So starting to see more and more users of those products, or getting involved in the development and providing technical and investment support into the smaller to medium-sized manufacturers to help them build capacity and capability. That's been a trend that we've seen the last couple of years.
Right. We have a question came up, and it's comparable, talking about how does Mexico compare to China? How does it compare to Southeast Asia for operating costs? We've got to kind of define here as number 3. This company is in the automotive space, and they've got a facility in Mexico, a facility in China, and they're looking to potentially relocate that to Mexico, right? Mm-hmm. And their market is North America. So we want to understand kind of operating in China versus operating in Mexico. What does that look like? What are the differences you're going to have?
Yeah. From a labor cost standpoint, not a lot of difference at this point. 20 years of 8 to 10% wage increases in China have essentially closed that gap. So there's not a lot of difference between the Mexico industrial sector and sort of the general coastal areas around China. Utility costs are a bit of a mixed bag. It sort of depends what sort of business you're in. Electricity cost is equivalent to or a little bit more than what you'd see in China or Southeast Asia, likely to be less than Eastern Europe. Natural gas, if you're a large consumer of natural gas, you're going to do better in Mexico, particularly sort of the northeast quadrant of the country, compared to Southeast Asia, China, or Eastern Europe. That part of the country, the gas fields are under Texas and under the northeast part of the country, so it's generally the prices you pay in the southeast U.S. are pretty equivalent to what you would pay in Mexico, which is much cheaper than what you'd see in Asia, certainly, where a lot of the natural gas supply is LNG. Lease rates and land costs, a variety in Mexico in general. If land cost is pretty high generally around Mexico City, particularly around Monterrey. But when you get away from that into other industrial areas, it's similar to China. Building costs and lease rates are a little bit higher in Mexico in developed areas, but not substantially higher than what we're seeing in China. When we look at rates quoted in Mexico versus rates quoted in China, not a lot of difference at that point. So from a cost standpoint, generally equivalent, but you'd have to be careful in utilities. I mentioned gas, I mentioned electricity. water costs, if you're a big water consumer, you can be a problem in Mexico versus some other parts of the world. So it's really sort of dependent on your industry.
The questions popped up here that kind of compared to number 5 here. They were talking about shipping product from China to Mexico versus shipping product from Mexico, getting product into Mexico, and again product from Mexico up to the U.S. Can you all talk about any of the complications or the freight issues that people are having now?
Certainly. You know, I guess we start between, you know, shipping between the U.S. and Mexico. Primarily, that's been over the road trucks, and that's been a bit more challenging the last few years. Is, you know, historically it was pretty much in balance. The number of containers coming in, the number of containers going out were more in balance. Now there's more demand for containers going out, and so that's driven the costs up for over the road shipping, and the increased amount of traffic has resulted in some congestion at the border, which particularly around Laredo, which gets a lot of press. To sort of offset that, there's been more activity around intermodal, where if you've got some flexibility in delivery times, you know, bringing a trailer either an over the road trailer or a specific 53-foot shipping container to an intermodal station, and there are a handful of them around the country tied into Union Pacific and Kansas City Southern. That's become a more economical way to ship. If you're going as far as the upper Midwest to Chicago, you can save about 40% of your freight cost by using intermodal versus over the road. So that's pretty attractive. Other sort of shipping developments, when you're looking at Asia, shipping direct to Mexico, you know, the major freight port on the western Pacific coast is undergoing a substantial amount of investment to upgrade that and add capacity. That's being driven by the increased amount of trade going in. So that's a positive development, certainly. Stefan, did you have anything else?
Maybe I can say something about the late complications we had. During the last year, all the ports were given to a different authority in Mexico, meaning all the airports and all the seaports. They are now run by the Navy, which made things a little bit more complicated in the very beginning, because you do have non-experts there, experts in looking for explosives, and maybe drugs, but not for the product you're importing. So we had situations where in the invoice it was stated goods shipped in boxes, but the boxes sat on a skid. Now they rejected this import because the skid was not mentioned in the invoice, until we learned to phrase it correctly, that even the army would understand what we mean and what they look at. We had some trouble, being honest. But now, since we learned that, it's again easy to bring in a product with the right documentation, through any port in Mexico, and there is no problem with shipping anymore. But it showed that we needed somebody who bridged this gap of understanding, because we couldn't understand that somebody couldn't understand what was on the invoice. that there is no flexibility, no level of flexibility anymore. The wording has to be exactly as it should be, period. If you're lacking a dot, you will be rejected.
Devin, have they kind of cleaned it? You mentioned they've kind of begun to clean that problem. That was a bigger issue last year and a little bit this year. Then they began to clean that up some.
Yeah.
We had a question come in about someone looking one of the registrants is looking at establishing a business entity. They're either going to establish a manufacturing or an assembly operation, and they want to set up a sourcing office. So I thought it kind of connected to question here about the ease of establishing a business entity, permitting. Stefan, can you talk about that for a company that's coming in? This case is setting up a sourcing office and setting up manufacturing/assembly operation.
Yeah, my point of view is very simple. I'm living in Mexico, yeah, and I feel that it's much easier to establish a business in Mexico and get all the permissions than it is in Germany. Yeah, I would not like to open any business in Germany, but I would always do it in Mexico. Yeah, but this is my perspective living here. It might be completely different if you look from the outside, because you do not understand why does this guy want this stamp from me. Yeah, and but if you go there, there's a very simple explanation. So if you are at the location and you try to establish something and try to get the permission, and please do not run into the bribing. Yeah, many people offer to make things easier by some gift to the department. Yeah, which should not be done, because you're running into this ongoing game of only getting when you give. Yeah, and this is not that's not my German mind. Yeah. I stick to the legal environment. Yeah, so I still feel it's much easier than in many parts of the world to establish your business.
Interesting. And Dan, have you seen the same thing?
Well, as more of an outsider than Stefan, I've seen a few more challenges. Our recommendation is generally make sure you've got good legal counsel and good accounting counsel going in, to scale, so you understand they can help that are based locally, can help you understand all the complexities and the considerations. Have seen it somewhat from a bureaucratic standpoint. Have seen it somewhat less than what we've seen in China, where you've got a long list of permits and forms and applications. The difference between the way people manage in China is generally you've got depending where you go, but most people are going into an industrial park, an industrial zone that's got a staff there to help you navigate those requirements. And so it's a little bit of a change in approach there. So.
Well, that's kind of a good segue in, talking a little bit about the manufacturing infrastructure. We've had some questions come in around what are the more popular sites. But can we just talk a little bit about, Dan, address and Stefan, the availability of the industrial parks, the lease facilities, greenfield sites. I mean, we're obviously doing a lot on the site selection piece now. Can you address that, Dan and Stefan?
Well, yeah, I mean, industrial parks are available. They tend to be smaller than if you've been working in Asia for a while. They're smaller area-wise. The land plots are generally smaller, more focused on the 50 to 150,000 square foot manufacturing factory. If you're looking for something substantially larger than that, your pool of parks shrink, and you may actually be looking for having to go to a greenfield site. The advantage of having parks, it's getting utility connections is easier. We would do stress that you need to do particularly due diligence on site at those parks, because they can embellish the situation a little bit. So we always encourage you on-site due diligence to make sure the utilities are actually there, but they're available. If you're looking at there is plenty of greenfield land available. It's becoming available, and it's getting snapped up pretty regularly now. The market's pretty hot. Be aware that the permitting and construction cycle for a greenfield site, particularly around getting adequate utilities to it, is longer than what you might expect, particularly for electrical service to these sites. 24 months is not an unusual period of time, and the cost to run electricity is is high. So that's one consideration what we see. So, but the land's available, sites are available, but it's a little bit different environment to operate in.
Let me just step in real quick, Stefan, excuse me. Let me interrupt. It is 12 o'clock, which is the hour, right? So we promise everyone we keep to a schedule. So the webinar is officially over. Dan and Stefan, we've still got some questions coming in. If you all don't mind taking 5 minutes and just answering a few more questions for those who sent them in, if that would be okay. But for those who get off at an hour, webinar is still here, but we still got questions coming in, so we want to entertain as many as we can. So thank you very much for attending. Everyone will receive this recorded video and presentation within the next 48 hours from us. If you have any questions, please let us know, but you'll receive the recording and the video in the next 48 hours. So thank you for attending. Dan and Stefan, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I just wanted to step in here and say, especially the industrial parks suffered a lot during the pandemic right now, and there was a withdrawal of business for some month, or at least it did not grow as it was predicted. So we have right now, I saw it at least in León and San Luis Potosí, and also here in Toluca, where I'm sitting right now, that are a lot of buildings available for lease, for rent, for sale, more than I saw before. So people built some industrial parks, and are now sitting on their on their investment, So maybe it's a time to come in right now,
The good point. The one of the questions that came in was a company that's looking at setting up that talked about setting up a sourcing office and a manufacturing operation. They brought up the question that they're getting some concern around just the safety of this is a U.S. company, getting in a little bit around employee safety, management safety, and they're talking about setting up the offices or setting up the supply chain and manufacturing centers in Mexico. They have some concerns about employee safety. So if they've got manufacturing infrastructure available, are there certain trends, and we talked about it here on question 8, certain trends in security that they need to know about, because that's going to be part of, a critical piece of them selecting the right location for the sourcing, trading office, and for the assembly operation. So Dan and Stefan, can you all address that a bit?
Well, when we take on a site selection, a couple of things we look at, sort of higher level data that's available to help guide us. There's pretty good information from the U.S. Homeland Security that they issue travel advisories, and then you can just look at the number of and frequency of and seriousness of the travel advisories by state. That's one way to parse it, to get a sense of it anyway. That's on a statewide level and not particularly local to any particular city usually. Another piece of information that's published out there, which is interesting, goes hand in hand with that, is the Mexican government bodies, is usually done at the state level. They frequently, I believe annually, poll the populace on how safe and secure they feel. And so it's a self monitoring of how folks feel about their own personal security and safety around there. And so that data is published, and you can use that also to parse and pre-select sort of areas of the country to stay away from. So those are sort of some high-level guidance, data that you could look at.
Yeah, and I would say all the developed areas are fairly safe. I would consider them safe. I have no problem traveling there by car or moving around in Mexico, but I'm living here for more than 20 years, so maybe I'm getting used to certain situations which I would not expect in Europe or in the US. What is clear, and I would not recommend it, driving by night in unknown areas. regardless if it's the highway or if it's within a city. Streets are not that well maintained as we might expect. And if you have an accident or something happening there, it's probably getting more difficult if we include this in the security question. But during a daytime, I would not have any problem moving around.
Stefan, could you talk a little bit about Monterey and San Luis Potosi and
Yeah,
those regions?
Actually, as mentioned here, Torreon, Monterey, San Luis Potosi are the fairly safe areas, where you do not hear anything about kidnapping and things like that, or you do not hear more than the expected level. Any big city has murders, burglars, and everything, but to a certain level, so these areas, including Querétaro and even Mexico City, and Puebla, I see are fairly safe areas. Silao is becoming a little bit more difficult, especially Celaya, which was unfortunately one of the the city with the highest murder rate based on capita. It's a small city, by the way, so there were definitely not more murders than in New York, but related to the inhabitants there, it's fairly high. So this seems to be a little bit more difficult, this area, but it's always changing. The ones we mentioned before, the safe ones, have been safe all the time, and others are changing. So it's difficult to predict what will happen, but myself, I feel absolutely safe in Mexico.
Good. Well, that's good. Well, that's certainly part of the site selection process. So we're doing that, right? We don't have that in other countries necessarily, but we definitely have it there. But it is, I mean, you're right, it is changing. Who would have thought Tijuana used to have such bad reputation? Now it's got a lot of medical device companies. I mean, it's significantly improved. Question came in, and it's number 9 about the pro-union government, the business environment, regulatory environment. How is that? Everything we're reading talks about, the president may be more pro-union, and there's some labor wage increases he's looking for. But has that really affected the overall business environment? Has it dampened companies coming in?
Actually, 3 years ago, when the president was elected, he immediately started with a pro-union government, and talking about entrepreneurs, companies, like they steal from the country. But that's a superficial. Well, that's something he has to say to keep the masses behind him. In fact, the laws have not changed that dramatically. That they would hinder business to go on. We have a much stricter tax supervision. That's true. You have to adhere to certain rules and regulations there that before were a little bit easier. But once you do that, it is the same process as before, and it is not changing your business anymore. What changes are the permanent increases in minimum salaries, because usually your workforce compares themselves to these increases, even though you might pay double of the minimum salary already to your workforce because they are much more skilled than the minimum wages. they would expect an increase that is similar to the minimum wages. This is driving an uncertainty, and here comes in the union. Yeah, and I would take number 10. Yeah, the question number 10: what legal union obligations are required? Yeah, you have to have a union if your company is bigger than, I'm not quite sure. I think it's even 100 people. Yeah, workforce. But the union is not only an obligation. The union can be a support if you have a good relationship to your union. Yeah, and you as the owner of a company, you can establish which union you go with. Yeah, you make the contract with, and it's not about bribing. It's about how you manage your labor force. Yeah, and so it is not only, it is not always a bad um, aspect to bring in union. Union also supports you in working overtime. You do not have to negotiate salaries with each operator. Yeah, you have a very good established contract, always for 1 or 2 years, and usually for 2 years actually. And so your business is much more calculable and controllable, since you have this, and there will not be any change. Yeah, you do not suffer any strikes or whatever, uh, um, just because somebody says we want more money. Yeah, it has to be the union saying that, and they would not move until the contract is over, or all of your workforce would say, union, now do something. Yeah, so it is usually supporting your work in Mexico. Yeah, and the
That's a little different
government,
than the
huh?
U.S. Yeah,
Yes,
it's a little
yeah,
different than the U.S. Yeah.
yeah, and
Look, a question also popped up while we're talking about this. We had an earlier question about comparing Mexico to China, and you both got experience, Dan and Stefan. The question came in about brain drain, and Stefan, you hit on this earlier, was around this company that's here, this electronics firm, was looking at moving to Mexico. The question for them was, one of the challenges they have in China, right, is a concern about the loss of IP, right? That it's kind of a systematic, the fear of that, of losing that. So Dan and Stefan, can you all talk a little bit about the IP loss in China versus IP loss in Mexico?
in Mexico, you would probably lose IP if we are talking about movies and CDs and everything that is copied and sold on the black market. Yeah, but going into technology, uh, there is no systematic brain drain. Yeah, there is in fact there is nobody, at least what I saw from the automotive electronics, um, there is nobody who is really interested in taking your technology. It's only the interest in cooperation and making money with you. Yeah, but it's not taking away your property. Yeah, your intellectual property. So I would say, from my point of view, Mexico has a big advantage not having this systematic uh, ex exposure to stealing technology and stealing ideas. Yeah, than you might see in Asian countries.
Yeah, and we see that same kind of attitude among U.S. European companies that are coming in
Yeah,
to make sure. I think they seem to feel the same way.
yeah.
Dan, would you want to add anything to that?
Very little to add. I think that was a good summary. One of the early indicators is, when there's a new relationship developing between companies that, sort of a standard practice is to enter into non-disclosure agreements. So that's, very well understood, accepted, and turned around quickly and respected in the market there. That's one thing I've noticed pretty obviously.
And it's the final question that has come in is if this company was looking at, the two companies came in with this, they're looking to set up this, I guess it's assembly operation or sourcing and manufacturing. Anyway, they break down by the different incentives that the different states in Mexico have. I think Stefan, you touched on earlier, and Dan, you did as well, that obviously the federal incentives coming from the government aren't there like they were years and years ago, but that each incentive is really more of a state by state incentive, right? To get someone to put in an assembly operation, get someone to bring jobs there. Do those incentives change dramatically from different states, or is the same kind of training incentives, the same kind of taxes, they're pretty similar across the different states in northern Mexico or in central Mexico?
No, it's definitely a regional thing, and the attractiveness of business, for the specific area. An example is you could the aerospace industry. How did they go to Querétaro? Because there were good talks between the governor and the company that would like to establish business there, and the governor had the vision to understand this will drive technology. I want this here, and this is why the incentives were given. Whenever you are able to do this, you will find somebody supporting you, and trying to move incentives. And this is not really related to the regions. It is visible for the growth of some of the regions is related to the incentives that were given, but it's not a fact that you would receive them again if you would do the same business again in the same region. Maybe if you try to establish a different business there, you might get an incentive because you're attractive enough for diversifying the business in the region. I know for a fact that the federal government said we are not supporting the automotive industry anymore. But I'm pretty sure if somebody is attractive enough, he will receive the support again.
Sure.
Because it is a commitment to develop in a certain area where there might not be automotive right now. So it's something that needs to be developed in very good conversations with the guys in charge in these areas.
Mm-hmm. It's all very local. I mean, up to the state level. You mentioned the governor. It's from the state level down, and you can see differences between industries, what's offered, and just sort of geography around a major city. We had a situation. We're in the middle of a situation now where we're doing a site selection, and sort of the north part of the city has been underdeveloped, as they're very eager to talk about opportunities and what they may be offered. The south part of the city is fully developed, and so they're fine. There's not going to be as much there, so as you might expect. And it could be training incentives, it could be payroll tax, holidays. One thing to explore is really around utility supply and whether there's any opportunity to get support around establishing new utilities for your factory, which depending on the type of business you're in can be substantial. So those are the sorts of things that we see.
Well, look, thank you very much. We're 20 minutes past due, We still got more questions coming in, but we'll respond to them later in writing. I know we still have
to
people.
step out.
Yeah, but it's a good set of questions. People stayed on and wanted to hear them. Dan, Stefan, thank you both very much for taking your time to do this. Thank you also for taking your time to stay late to answer all these questions. We won't take any more of your time. And for those whose questions we still have outstanding, we'll get back to you in writing in the next 2 to 3 days. So that concludes this webinar. Stefan, Dan, thank you all very much.
Okay, thanks.
Very good. Thank you. Bye-bye.